Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 18th, 2017, and my guest is author Robert Wright. His previous books include The Moral Animal and Non-Zero. His latest book, Why Buddhism Is True, argues that Buddhism and the practice of meditation is consistent with evolutionary biology and much of what we learned from the latest research in psychology. And that's our topic for today. Bob, welcome to EconTalk.
Well, thanks for having me, Russ. I'm really happy to be here.
Now, despite the title, Why Buddhism Is True, this is not really a religious book. It reminds me a little bit about a story I've heard attributed to Enrico Fermi, but it's probably been attributed to other scientists as well. Supposedly a student comes into Fermi's office, and as he's leaving, he notices there's a horseshoe over Fermi's door. And the student turns back to Professor Fermi and says, "Professor Fermi, you don't really believe that, do you?" And Fermi says, "Well, of course not, but they say it works even if you don't believe in it." And your book reminds me a little bit of that story. Your claim is that meditation and the Buddhist approach to mindfulness works even if you don't have a religious belief in Buddhism, say. So let's start with what you mean by meditation and what you mean by mindfulness for people who aren't who haven't heard of these topics and how they're applied in your book.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're right. The book isn't about the kind of most plainly religious parts of Buddhism. In other words, the parts that are often considered supernatural, like reincarnation. I do focus on claims you can evaluate from the standpoint of modern psychology and philosophy. And as for meditation, there are a lot of kinds. I mean, there are Buddhist kinds and non-Buddhist kinds, and even within Buddhism, there are a number of kinds. There's Zen meditation, and sometimes that involves contemplating these koans, these cryptic or paradoxical sayings or questions. Tibetan meditation often involves visualization, sometimes elaborate visualizations. Mindfulness, the kind I focus on mainly in the book, is about, it's kind of an exercise in attention, you could say. It's about calming your mind enough, typically by focusing on your breathing for a while, but calming your mind enough so that you can observe things with more care and clarity than usual. A lot of those things are inside your head. They don't have to be. You can focus on sounds mindfully, but a lot of the things you focus on are inside your head, like feelings. And with feelings, you employ, I guess, what you could call a kind of objectivity of perspective that is unusual. I mean, usually what we do with feelings is react to them, typically without thinking about them very much or observing them very closely. But with mindfulness, you might take something like anxiety that you normally kind of react to and try to get away from, and you just kind of accept it, live with it, and thereby allow yourself to actually examine it. That can lead to a kind of loosening of its grip on you. And this is probably the most famous use of mindfulness is in this kind of therapeutic way you view feelings, as they sometimes say, non-judgmentally, and this loosens the grip, particularly of unpleasant feelings that you'd like to see the grip of loosened. But I would say that mindfulness meditation, in principle, goes a lot deeper than that and has a deep connection to some of the most radical philosophical claims made in Buddhism. And in the book, I kind of start out with the therapeutic stuff, and as the book progresses, I move toward the deeper stuff, I guess you could say. You
break the reader in gently. I want to start with the therapeutic side, though, because I think for someone who has never meditated or attended a silent meditation retreat, and I've done both, and in advance of that experience, in advance of attending a silent meditation retreat, I'd never meditated. And I went in with a great deal of skepticism, and I would imagine that listeners who have not meditated or attended a retreat like this would have an incredible amount of skepticism about it. And so I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about this claim that I would say it's more about emotions than feelings. Of course, they can mean the same thing, but that various emotions that arise in us can be controlled in a way they otherwise can't be through the process of meditation. That seems like an absurd claim, right? So if I said to you, and some people say this, I don't agree with it, but it's a common claim. Oh, you've just watch your breath. Just sit for 20 minutes a day and try to clear your head and pay attention to your breath, and you'll become a happier person. And that's, again, for a person who hasn't meditated, that sounds ludicrous. And for someone who has, I don't think that's quite enough. So try to flesh out the claim to make it a little more plausible for people who have not experienced it.
Right. Well, first of all, like you, I actually had tried to meditate before my first silent meditation retreat. I just never succeeded. So a silent retreat was what convinced me that there was something there. I think a lot of people who are more natural meditators than I am might not have to go to a retreat to become convinced of the power of the technique. But you're right that a lot of times people say just focus on your breath. I think that can calm people. I think that can be a good thing in itself. But with true mindfulness meditation, you are going deeper than that, and that is really a preparatory phase. The calming of the mind is just preparation to view things more carefully, and just to give people a sense of the potential power of mindfulness. I remember a few weeks after my first meditation retreat, I was doing this crazy thing I do sometimes, which is I had a big talk the next day, and so I woke up in the middle of the night and I started thinking, wait a second, what if I can't get to sleep? Then I'll do a terrible job of the talk. And of course, it's completely irrational to respond by the news that you need to sleep by failing to get to sleep, but that's the way anxiety can work. And so I thought, well, I'll sit up, do what you're supposed to do with mindfulness, sit up, not run away from the feeling, not just observe it, be with it. And in a few minutes, I got to a point where the anxiety in my abdomen, and meditation makes you more aware of where in your body feelings are, for starters. But I started, suddenly I was viewing it the way I would view a piece of abstract art in a museum. It was interesting. I wasn't particularly attracted or repelled by it. It was neither good nor bad. It was just kind of interesting. I was examining its contours. It had completely lost its grip on me, and shortly after that, it dissolved. Now, I'm not going to claim that an experience quite that dramatically therapeutic is trivially easy to attain by any means. I mean, this was like right after a meditation retreat when you're kind of in the zone. But some measure of that, I think, is accessible to people with a relatively modest commitment and a meditative commitment, maybe 20 minutes in the morning or something. And I believe it is a step toward actual clarity. And this is, I don't want to go to tell me if I'm going too fast, but I think one of the fascinating things about Buddhism is the claim that the reason we suffer is because we don't see the world clearly, which is also, they say in Buddhism, the reason we make other people suffer, the reason we kind of misbehave. And so by clarifying your view of the world, you can become a happier and better person. That's an amazing claim. And I think looking at your feelings in a sense more objectively is an example of a way that can work. But I just do want to emphasize, it's kind of an analytical exercise. I emphasize this for your listeners in particular. I view, there's an old saying, I mentioned these different kinds of meditation, that Zen is for poets, Tibetan meditation is for artists, Vipassana, which is a kind of meditation closely associated with mindfulness, is for psychologists. And it is in some respects an analysis of your own mind.
So I want to get your thoughts on where that power comes from that you alluded to in that night before your speech. I've had a number of moments like that as well. And of course, we could be fooling ourselves, which is always interesting. But let's assume we're not fooling ourselves about the control that we might have. What I found extraordinary is that things that used to create anger in me, impatience, annoyance, arrogance, and various other emotions, by observing them and watching them somewhat dispassionately arise in myself, I've been able to, as you say, they lose some of their power over us. And it's interesting, there's a strong tradition of meditation in Judaism, makes the same mystical thinkers in Judaism made the same claim that by letting your demons in rather than running from them, which is our one standard method we have about our demons. The second method is to fight them. The third method, which some would argue just seems to make it worse, and the third method is to just let them in. And that's part of who you are. You can't avoid it. You have lots of flaws and character traits that influence you, and by observing their influence rather than just being influenced in the heat of the moment, you can have some serenity. And also, this is the more important point to me, you can decide what to do rather than having your anger decide what you do. And I think that's, to me, the biggest payoff. So the challenge that I want to raise, though, is I wonder, in your experience, how much of that control, to the extent you have, and of course you don't have it all the time. It's not, I don't mean to suggest I'm now this masterful, self-controlled person, but I feel like I have more control. I feel like I'm a better husband, a better father, as a result, friend. How much of that do you think comes from in your case, it sounds like about 30 minutes to more a day of just sitting and observing the breath or being aware of your thoughts versus the intensity, which is very daunting for most people, of a 5-day or a week-long or a 2-week meditation retreat where you're forced to confront yourself. And I found that very powerful. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, retreats are important to me, and this I'd say especially about my first retreat, because for one thing, they allow you to see what is possible in principle. Right. By the end of my first retreat, I felt radically transformed. I was seeing beauty in places I had never seen it before. I was much less judgmental of people. I remember at the beginning of this retreat, I was like sizing up the other retreatants. And since you're not going to talk to them, you might as well use entirely superficial grounds, which, let's face it, we're inclined to do anyways. And I remember seeing this guy wearing a T-shirt that said Juilliard on it and thinking, oh, well, aren't we special?
Yeah.
And then at the end of the retreat, this is what we do, right? And the guy, at least I do, I never know whether I'm worse than average.
You're the only one, Bob.
Then this has been a very unfortunate experience for me. I had been under the illusion that I was not uniquely bad. Yeah. And then at the end of the retreat, the silence was broken. We can ask questions. And this guy stands up. He's the most timid, insecure soul you can imagine. He's virtually quivering as he asks his question. So, of course, I totally misgauged him. But, and then when I called my wife at the end of the retreat, she says that before I had said anything about the retreat, just by the tone of my voice, she was delighted about the new Bob. Now, as you know, this doesn't last forever. Unfortunately, life is not an endless meditation retreat. Reality intrudes, and you kind of wind up hanging on to what you as much as you can of the mindset you had at the end of the retreat via some kind of daily practice, if you maintain that discipline. And that's worth doing, I think, for sure. But the retreat shows you what is in principle possible, and in my case at least, helped convince me, along with other things, along with considerations from evolutionary psychology and so on, but helped convince me that this actually is a clearer view of the world. The one I had at the retreat was a clearer, because after all, I didn't know anything about that guy with a Juilliard t-shirt. It was a delusion to think that I had enough information to judge him, right? It was kind of an emotionally driven illusion in some sense. And I think, so retreats help convince me of the potential and in a certain sense validity of the practice in being a way to clarify your vision. And then they also serve as periodic reinforcers. I try to do a retreat close to once a year because, as time wears on, it's easy to start getting lazy about your practice on any given morning, even though you are convinced at some level that your day will go better if you practice, you may feel you don't have the time or whatever. And so I like retreats as a little booster. And I guess those are the two main functions I see them serving.
I want to talk a little bit about the judgmental comment you made. And the big theme in the reading I've done and in the meditation I've done is to try to reduce my judgmental aspects toward myself and towards others, which is very that really goes against my grain. I spent a lot of my life being judgmental of myself and of others, and felt virtuous about it, of course, even which makes it even more difficult to think about. It might not have been such a good idea. But one argument would be against that, being less judgmental, is that it tends to make us a little more wishy-washy, a little more maybe too tolerant of things that are not good. And also there's a passivity in some of the mindfulness literature that, just be in the present, just enjoy life right now, because that's all there is. That's a standard claim. And of course, that's not really all there is. There's the past, which haunts us and maybe should. There's the future, which we want to enjoy and need to plan for. And so comment on that, those sort of I would call them critiques of the Buddhist approach of not being judgmental and being relatively, quote, living in the moment.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's interesting that actually, if you go back and look at the seminal text that is millennia old on mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta, there's actually no mention of living in the moment. There's no phrase that can be translated as the moment or the present. And, to some extent, the meditation that is being taught in the West is being adapted to its current context, in which staying in the moment is so challenging because of the technological environment and so on. That said, I don't think it's an invalid emphasis. I mean, if you do all the things that it says to do in that ancient sutra, you will be in the moment, because it's asking you to systematically observe things, your feelings, your thoughts, your perceptions, sounds, and so on. And so you will be in the moment. Now, as for the judgment question, I mean, that's another thing that's actually not explicit in the text. But again, I think it's true to the spirit of Buddhism to say that you're viewing your feelings without judgment. And the question you raise is a common one. In other words, if in a way the goal of Buddhism, broadly speaking, or a goal, is to allow you to sustain well-being even in adverse circumstances, which is one thing it is about, is there not a danger that you'll become content with any circumstances whatsoever, and not judge certain things as bad things you want to change? You hear this from social activists, for example, this concern, like, will I lose my passion for social justice? My feeling about that is it's a very good in principle question and not a very urgent in practice question. In other words, I can imagine you going so far down the path that you would sit around meditating pretty much all the time and be a pretty contented person. Or even if you weren't meditating all the time, go through life so contented with things, so non-judgmental that you were not a particularly positive force in the world, even though I would say at a minimum you were at least no longer part of the problem, and that's something, right? Yeah. Because if you really follow the Buddhist path, you will have relinquished the selfish, the obviously selfish impulses and the subtly selfish cognitive biases that lead us to misbehave. So in a way, it's not a net loss if you really get close to, so-called enlightenment or whatever. But I think for almost everyone, that question just doesn't arise. Speaking for myself, I do care a lot about issues of policy and various ethical issues. And I think for me, it has been a challenge to not let the intensity of my concern get in the way of actually wisely advancing the causes I'm interested in. And I think, honestly, that's the position of 99.9% of the people who raise these questions is it would be a good problem to have if you attained such equanimity, that you were no longer trying to do the things that you feel need doing right now. I don't think that problem arises very often.
Yeah, for me, I just find it fascinating. I've read a lot of books on the present moment in various formats. It's not literally, some are literally called something close to that, but they don't. I don't find them very helpful or interesting. What I do find helpful and interesting is the idea that when I'm talking to someone, I'm giving them my full attention, which is not easy to do. And meditations help me to do that rather than at a party looking around and thinking, who else can I talk to? Who's more interesting?
Right.
And I think that's a terrible thing to be doing that. I'm really glad I do a little bit less of it. And the other thing is it does help you appreciate, as you pointed out earlier and as you mentioned a number of places in the book, moments of natural beauty, human compassion, poignance in the world that you missed just because you weren't paying attention, that you just didn't. And they're simple things. It's a flock of birds overhead. It's the leaves changing on the trees. It does give you an opportunity to savor life, I think, a little more vividly if it's used correctly.
It really does. And it's not entirely clear to me why it does. In other words, I might think that the case would be what people often assume it is, which is that if you're looking at some of your feelings in a more objective way, there is some kind of like dulling of feelings in the aggregate or something, but that's not really what happens. I mean, it's true that some of the less fortunate feelings and some of the more kind of distorting feelings can lessen in impact, but, in other realms, I mean, you take more delight in aesthetic experiences of various kinds. I remember my first meditation retreat, I noticed that some people were eating with their eyes closed, and I'm like, what's up with this? And then I realized they are so immersed in the flavor, and they just want to make it total immersion. Yeah, it's incredibly intense. I mean, and it's not even the kind of food I would normally think I'd like. It was, it wasn't. It was very healthy food, and it was just amazing. I had an experience in my first retreat where I was taking a walk in the woods, and I saw a weed. It's called a plantain weed of a kind. I'd spent a lot of time trying to kill this weed because it had infested my lawns. And suddenly I looked at it and I thought, like, why have I been trying to kill this weed? I mean, viewed in a sense dispassionately, it's just as beautiful as all the other plants in the forest. And by the way, I don't want to get into like kind of Buddhist arcana. I mean, I do toward the end of the book, and in fact, I use this very example. But I actually think that's an example. What I was experiencing was an example of what is called, kind of misleadingly, the apprehension of emptiness in Buddhism. I think what that really means is you no longer impose the kind of sense of essence on things, right? So I wasn't feeling essence of weed. There was a subtle way that feelings had been shaping my perception of a weed that I hadn't really understood. And this was like a subtle and yet deep perceptual shift. And I think a lot of times the perception of essence gets in the way, especially when we impose kind of negative essences on certain humans without sufficient evidence and so on. But the point you're making is right and very important, that although on the one hand, kind of the Hallmark card version of mindfulness, live in the moment, is A, not true to the original text, and B, doesn't really get at the deepest part of this. It is a very welcome side effect of mindfulness meditation to appreciate, look, the person you're talking to at the cocktail party, whom you normally might be trying to get away from, and to appreciate just the visual and beauty and other kinds of sensory beauty in the world.
So I want to take it in a slightly different direction, and to bring it to some standard EconTalk themes that listeners might be aware of. So some people might say, well, but you're wasting your time talking to that loser at the cocktail party. And that plantain weed is nasty. It's not as pretty as a rose, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think you use the phrase essence, use the word essence, but I think of it, and this is the tie into other EconTalk themes, I think of it as a narrative. a narrative that we have running in our head about who's worth talking to, what's worth looking at. And we have that same narrative running in our head about politics. We have it running in our head about religion or anti-religion. We have it running in our head about our marriage, about our family, about our friends. And as a result, we fit everything into that narrative. We have a terrible tendency to cherry pick reality and ignore the stuff that doesn't fit the narrative. So that person with the ugly T-shirt or the arrogant sneer or whatever it is obviously is a waste of time when in fact you could be wrong. That weed is – you've got this baggage you've been carrying around because you try to get it out of your yard, but it is beautiful. Yeah. A starling, my favorite example of this is a starling is a gorgeous bird. There are a lot of them, and they're also a big nuisance to a lot of people, so they got a bad rep. But if you watch a starling in the sunlight in the sunlight, it's a gorgeous iridescent creature that you've been sort of talked into, culturally decided, without much thought, without any thought. And that's your feeling about the weed. That's your feeling about that person you're treating like a weed, to be avoided, ignored, gotten rid of. Right. And I just think when the things you're talking about work correctly, the clarity that you're talking about isn't some mystical I'm seeing the universe in some new way, although that can happen. But it's really as much about the fact that you're missing out on so much because you're running this movie in your head that you've directed and you've got the ending figured out, and anything that doesn't fit in with that plot, you just cast out, and you're missing out.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, I'd kind of distinguish between the weed and the person at the cocktail party. I would say it is just objectively not true that the weed is ugly, because beauty, that's an entirely subjective thing. So if you don't think it's ugly, it's not ugly. Now, there is such a thing as a case where if you were talking to one person at a cocktail party rather than the other, it would do more for your career. That's possible.
Absolutely.
That's possible.
No doubt.
And so that's a slightly different case. At the same time, if you, first of all, you're right. People, I just started for the first time doing Uber and Lyft and so on. I mean, every conversation, I've talked to cab drivers all my life, but so this is not in a certain sense new. It's just kind of a new demographic that I'm talking to, and you always learn stuff, and moreover, if you look at the way you're feeling at a cocktail party when you're just urgently trying to, maximize your social and professional opportunities, are you really happy? It's a restless, unpleasant feeling, right? It's like a desperate feeling. Now, that said, even if you talk to these very accomplished meditators and teachers, they are not entirely impervious to even the career implications of things. You don't have to worry about becoming entirely blind to that. Still, it is worth remembering that you just never know what path will lead to what, right? It's like, I could give you an example, but, it's kind of, I just thought of this. It's like the title of my book, Why Buddhism Is True. First of all, it has pros and cons. I can understand people finding it obnoxious and arrogant. I am willing to defend it if pressed, and I have a whole appendix of the book that does. But one thing that's interesting is one of the more painful experiences of my life was a review of my last book, The Evolution of God, by a guy, Jerry Coyne, who wrote a book called Why Evolution Is True. Now, I didn't consider the review fair, as is not unusual among authors who get negative reviews. Yep. I wrote the New Republic kindly let me print the reply in the actual magazine. But in any event, I just considered that a wholly unfortunate, bad experience. In retrospect, I suspect that if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had, that's probably the reason the phrase Why Buddhism Is True popped into my head, because he had occupied such a prominent place in my memory. And I have to say, for commercial purposes, at least the title seems to have worked. Book's doing well. So the point is just, you never know. You never know what experience is going to lead to what. And that's a reason for us all to obsess a little less over trying to seemingly maximize the kind of career or whatever kind of potential of every moment that we engineer. So I'm kind of just reaffirming what you said.
I just to extend it to a different EconTalk theme. There's a certain level of trust in emergence rather than in control. There's a certain, even at the individual level, where you have to. I always like to say, the dishes don't do themselves. You have to do them. You can't rely on the market to do your dishes, or some unseen process or self-regulating process. A lot of things in our daily life require our intention, our execution, our planning, and so on. Unlike, say, worrying about whether there are going to be enough pencils next year because the Chinese are sending a lot of kids to school who used to live in the countryside, and oh my gosh, I'm not going to have any pencils, and somehow that problem solves itself. We don't need a committee, and I don't have to worry about it. I just show up at Staples and they sell me pencils. I don't have to be told, well, we sold them all to the Chinese. They're gone. There are no pencils till 2019. So there's an inevitable top-down aspect to daily life as an individual or, say, as a family or a family member. But I think the process that you're talking about, and again, it's certainly in many religions, not just Buddhism, of letting things unfold without trying to manipulate every moment. It certainly makes you happier. But some people would say, well, you're just naive. You're foolish. You're letting things happen when you need to take charge of your life. It's not so much just being a cork in the ocean. It's about the process itself and a willingness to be surprised. And I think for a lot of us, surprise is painful. It scares us, and uncertainty scares us, and we want control. And that's a nice segue to the evolutionary side of this book, because I think obviously we spent a lot of our evolutionary history without control at all, living outside, so with predators. So it's a natural impulse, and I'm not sure it's such a healthy one in our environment. So talk about, you can react to that if you want, and then talk about what you see as the role of evolutionary psychology in thinking about these issues.
Well, I certainly agree that. I mean, I'm reluctant to agree because it does sound a little like a Hallmark card cliche. But when I say something about letting go and going with the flow and so on, but there truly is a kind of logic behind it. I also want to reaffirm what you said a little earlier about stories. We have stories. And in a way, this is a segue to the evolutionary psychology part, because we are creatures who tell stories about ourselves. I think we're designed by natural selection. Of course, I put designed in quotes, since natural selection is not a conscious process, but I think our minds are designed by natural selection to develop and cling to a story about ourselves. I am the person who writes good books, and so any reviewer who gives me a negative review is a bad
Obviously
person.
An idiot.
Right, and I will immediately look for bad things to say about that person. I mean, this stuff happens automatically. You don't have to think about any of that and yet when you look at it objectively, obviously this is not clarity of vision. But because there's no book that shouldn't have some negative things said about it, and doesn't mean that the person who said them is an idiot. And broadly speaking, this is kind of the broadest connection of Buddhism to evolutionary psychology, is that, as I said, the Buddhism says we are inclined to suffer recurringly. We are inclined to not see the world clearly. There is a connection between the two. If we saw the world more clearly, we would suffer less. Well, when I emerged from writing my book on evolutionary psychology, The Moral Animal, I was convinced of two things. We were not designed by natural selection to be happy. For starters, gratification is designed to evaporate. You eat food, feels good for a while, then you hunger for more. That makes sense as a way to design an animal if you want it to stay alive, right? For it to get recurringly hungry and for the gratification to evaporate. Secondly, feelings like fear and anxiety are natural. They're designed for a purpose, although they often misfire in the modern environment, which I get into in the book and complicates things. Still, the point is natural selection is willing to use our suffering as a motivator in many ways. And the other take home I had after writing about evolutionary psychology is we're not designed to see the world clearly. There are trivial examples of this, like people tend to overestimate the speed of approaching objects, which makes sense because it's better to get out of the way too soon than too late, right?
Yeah.
But that's an out-and-out misperception. That's a clear, objective misperception of the world. And there are all kinds of subtler misperceptions, some of which are emphasized in Buddhism and borne out in evolutionary psychology. But at any rate, I decided, this is one reason I decided to write this book. I thought that Buddhism needed to be looked at, and mindfulness meditation in particular, with a kind of systematic reference to the process that created the human mind, natural selection, because I think that does tend to validate a lot of the claims made by Buddhism and tend to explain why mindfulness meditation can be not just a successful therapeutic exercise, but a way to actually clarify your vision. Because these feelings that are built into us are, again, not designed to get us to see the world clearly. They're just designed to motivate us.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And I guess the thing that troubled me about a couple of things in the book. One, not that I'd give it a bad review, Bob. Don't worry. The thing that troubled me, one thing that troubles me about the evolutionary psychology approach is it is a little bit of a just so story after the fact, and I think it's very hard to disentangle, say, my desire for control with my primitive ancestors, my personal genetics, the cultural baggage I've picked up during my lifetime, the cultural baggage I was given by my parents when I was small and can't remember. So to me, it's a little more complicated. And in fact, you could argue, based on the data, that natural selection must have designed us for suffering, because we do a lot of it. Now, I understand your claim that we're burdened with a primitive mind, not so fit for modern times. But an alternative interpretation would be the human lot is to suffer. The human lot is because if for no other reason, we're the only animal that I know of that knows its death is inevitable and has to live every minute of adult consciousness with that awareness. I want to raise a question which I didn't find in the book, which I miss, about consciousness. Consciousness is really what gives us suffering. We could have been an animal. All the other animals, they have primal drives. They can't resist them at all. They don't, right? They're really bad at it. We're not good at it, but we're better than they are in some dimension, I suppose, or at least we think we are. Maybe that's an illusion. But it seems to me that the evolution of consciousness, the awareness of our suffering, our awareness of our challenges in life, and I don't want to be a pessimist. I think there's a lot of glorious things in life, obviously. I'm just being a little bit devil's advocate here. But it seems to me that consciousness itself is a big source of our challenge, and I don't think we have a very good evolutionary understanding of consciousness. So what do you think of that argument? Do you think we have or will have an understanding of consciousness that will help us, or do you think we've already solved it in the current psychology literature and the evolutionary psychology literature?
Let me first quickly say you're right about the kind of evidentiary challenges that evolutionary psychology faces, and actually evolutionary biology, showing that any trait is actually a product of natural selection is a distinctively challenging thing in the sciences, and I talk about that in my book on evolutionary psychology. But you're right that different claims about what is adaptive, a product of natural selection, deserve different degrees of confidence, and that includes the thing I said about approaching objects. We don't know for sure that that's an adaptation, but I deal with that in the evolutionary psychology book. You're right; it's definitely a valid question. I'd also emphasize, I agree with you. Suffering is built in by natural selection. That's part of the problem. It's not the only, but you're right, it's not the only problem. So anxiety is natural. To care what people think about you is natural, and for that to sometimes cause anxiety is natural. But then in a modern environment, you're thrown into a situation where you're suddenly speaking to 100 people you've never met. That's a new kind of situation, so it's not surprising that public speaking anxieties are particularly problematic and particularly unproductive. It does, they usually are not helping you. But anyway, on to consciousness. Now, my view of consciousness is, first of all, it's mysterious. In fact, I'd say if you want a book title that is arguably as audacious as mine. It's Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. At least as audacious, I might say.
I think that's true.
I don't think we have a satisfactory explanation of consciousness. I think you're right that self-awareness introduces a new dimension to suffering. I assume that when my dog feels pain or fear, it's unpleasant. But it's true that knowing that things will bring, it's like when you're at the dentist, knowing, it's like the anticipation of the unpleasantness is half of the problem. So self-awareness can bring new kinds of problems. If you mean, let me say something about consciousness that may not be what you're interested in, but
I don't care.
And it may be too cosmic, and it may.
Yeah, I'm not interested in anything. Go ahead.
Maybe too metaphysical, either in the legitimate Western philosophy sense of the word metaphysical, or in some indefensible sense. I don't know, but I sometimes think that consciousness. It's kind of a mystery why it's with us to begin with. Why it is like something to be an animal, because you can, in principle, imagine, animals that are built like they're built, do what they do, and it's not like anything to be them. They don't have subjective experience. But in any event, there is subjective experience. And one thing I wonder is whether it's like, for reasons we don't totally understand, the way complex consciousness can develop in this universe is through an evolutionary process that creates these complex biological systems of information processing. But by virtue of the nature of the dynamics of natural selection, there has to be, in a certain sense, a distortion of consciousness, a warping of it to bring it into existence, because this is, stop me when I'm going too far, Russ, but because of the weird criteria by which natural selection designs things, whatever gets the most genes into the next generation wins. After all, it is that criterion that so often fills our consciousness with a kind of a grasping, a recurring dissatisfaction. It's rather than letting us relax into a simple awareness of and appreciation of the world, right? It's because we were designed by natural selection that our consciousness is so often, you might say adulterated by this grasping, and I would say out and out warped. Our perception is out and out warped in various ways I talk about in the book, as a legacy, I think, of the fact that natural selection created the mind. And maybe it's the case that we can, in principle, use the reflective power that, as you noted, we have to reflect on the way our minds work and engage in things that even change in the way our minds work, such as meditation, to remove at least a little of what I'm calling the warping from consciousness and let it relax into a state that is a lot more pleasant for us, and I would say at least as productive as us. Now, I may have said it at least as much as you want to hear about consciousness.
No, that's all right. I'm happy to say a little bit more. I'm going to try to push it in a different direction, which is a number of serious philosophers have suggested that there's no evolutionary justification for consciousness. These are atheists, by the way. It's important to note. They're not trying to justify a non-evolutionary view of the world. I would add, by the way, that I believe in God. I'm going to come back to the religious aspects of my meditation maybe at the end, but I don't think believing in God and leading a religious life is inconsistent with evolution. I have no problem with it. I know others disagree with that, but I just thought that might be important to mention. But a lot of serious philosophers who are not religious think that there's no evolutionary explanation for consciousness. We're going to need a different understanding of biology and evolution to get to understand how the mind is where it is today, the modern mind, the human mind. And that's a weird thought for a book like yours, because you're arguing that we're burdened, our consciousness or our brain is burdened by this evolutionary legacy, and that Buddhism or meditation can unburden us. And yet it's kind of weird to think about the possibility that it's not evolution. I'm not saying it's something else. From a secular perspective, we have no idea what it is, but it's a little bit weird.
Well, the whole thing is weird. I think my own guess is that, there's some kind of metaphysical law in the legitimate sense of the term metaphysical that associates consciousness with certain kinds of information processing. I want to say, and this is related to God in a certain sense, because I've actually argued in other places, I think never with as much clarity and care as I should argue it at some point, but I've made the argument that if you step back and look at the entire evolutionary process, not just the biological evolution that created human beings, but the cultural evolution, meaning technological, all kinds of, scientific, political, so on, evolution, that has gotten our species to the brink of a global community and that has built this thing that looks like a global brain, the internet.
Yeah.
I have argued that it's not crazy to think that there's some kind of purpose, larger purpose unfolding, even if you have a strictly materialist view of what drives it, which I basically do. Natural selection created us. That set in motion these material technologies and so on. So you can have a materialist view of the whole process and yet step back and see it as, in a certain sense, a single kind of coevolutionary process that's been building something that looks like a giant planetary organism. And I think it's not crazy to wonder whether that, in some sense, manifests a larger purpose, leaving aside the question of whether what instilled the purpose was a god or something more like some kind of meta-natural selection process, whatever. But the point is, if you view it that way, then maybe when people like you and me recommend reflecting on our feelings and thoughts with an eye to revising the way we perceive the world and behave, that on the one hand we seem to be flowing against the stream of natural selection. And in fact, in the book I say, look, if it helps you to think of mindfulness meditation as a rebellion against natural selection, fine, in some sense it is, because you're kind of trying to rid your mind of some of the distortions it built into us. That said, it could be that if we want to progress in the larger evolutionary sense, in other words, build a cohesive global community that is not fraught by all kinds of tribal conflict, ranging from sectarian conflict in the Middle East to political polarization at home in America, as we see now, it may be that if we want to do that and sustain the evolutionary process in that larger sense, we need to attain some kind of like metacognition of one kind or another, whether it's via mindfulness meditation or whatever, that does give us a critical perspective on the minds that natural selection left us with. Does that make sense? So,
well, there's a lot there. It's a very provocative set of thoughts. My footnote to it is that you don't have to be religious to think that there are some glorious things in the world that have nothing to do with natural selection. Our love of beauty. It's hard to understand that is selected for. Maybe it's just a byproduct. Maybe it's just something that came along. We don't understand it, obviously, but there are many, many things, and the idea that we have a meta-consciousness as a species through things like the internet, through EconTalk, just to pick a slightly less grand thought, that there's it's such a beautiful thing to me that there are tens of thousands of people listening to this conversation, not simultaneously because they're hearing it recorded, but somehow we're together. And I get wonderful email from you out there who's, you say, I feel like you write me and you say, I feel like I know you so well, which is weird because you don't know me at all, the listener. And yet somehow we have this communal experience, which I don't think has anything to do with extending the species, or genes in the next generation, but it's a beautiful thing. And
yeah, it is. I mean, there are evolutionary psychologists who have made arguments that in a certain sense, that a lot of our aesthetic preferences can be explained by natural selection. And I'm generally a booster of explaining a whole lot of things via natural selection. That said, when I appreciate on a meditation retreat or in daily life the way a more relaxed consciousness, a more relaxed mind is more appreciative of beauty, I sometimes wonder, just to get cosmic, and whether appreciation of things is almost the default state of consciousness, and it's and it's and again, it gets kind of warped in a certain sense in its normal everyday workings. But I certainly do not believe that consciousness per se is adequately understood.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of wonder, and I think wonder and awe are undervalued in our culture, or not undervalued in our culture, but just all of us miss out on it a lot, and it's out there, it's everywhere.
That is a feeling that is well cultivated by meditation. I mean, I have, especially on retreat, I have found myself almost literally, and at the risk of discrediting myself entirely, almost literally caressing a tree. In other words, just looking at the bark, the structure of the bark on a tree, and, examining and going at, I normally don't notice this. It's amazing. To
reduce my credibility, I mean, there are many moments in those experiences where, and you write about this in your book, where you're moved to tears by things that don't normally move you to tears. And it's a deep question as to whether, again, that's the real you or some you you've created through this bizarre, unnatural experience.
But it's important because I think you're kind of emphasizing we are not talking about a neutralizing of experience, which people sometimes think. They think, well, wait, you're going to dull all your feelings? No, you change your relationship to your feelings. You can become less enslaved by problematic feelings, but in a certain sense, life becomes more poignant.
I think, and you could argue that's not a good idea. And similarly, you could argue, I disagree, but you could argue also, one of the things I love most in life is letting my thoughts just wander around, and see where they go, and don't try to stop them, and don't try to be aware of them, and getting lost in my thoughts is one of my favorite activities. And meditation suggests that maybe that's not the best practice, and yet I'm kind of addicted to it. And it's interesting to have to deal with that as a meditator.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that one of the first things that happens, and we now know this through brain scans, in meditation, when you succeed in relaxing, is that your so-called default mode network quiets down. That's a network that is active in your brain when your mind is wandering. But it's not like you're ending all mind wandering. I mean, you're going to be walking around. It's still going to be happening. It probably has some function. But, an interesting thing I've noticed is that, presumably one function of mind wandering is you address little issues and you solve certain problems. I've noticed sometimes when I'm meditating, I'll attain a state of calm and suddenly an idea will just pop up that actually is the solution to a problem. In my life, or it's an idea that I should pursue. And it's important to remember that, I certainly emphasize this in the book, that there's a lot of subterranean activity in the mind. There's a lot of stuff going on. And in fact, one commonality of modern psychology and traditional Buddhist teaching is to be kind of skeptical of the extent to which what you think of as the conscious self is really in charge in the first place, right? More than I think we realize, the work is being done at a subterranean level by perhaps a variety of kind of actors in our brain that have different agendas. And the results of the process are kind of injected into consciousness. And so to the extent that that's true, there's less to worry about than you might think of kind of relaxing, because the truth is the conscious mind is designed to think it's doing more than it actually is in the first place.
Yeah, we've talked about this many times on the program. The example I always like is Andrew Wiles solving Fermat's last theorem.
Right.
He proves it. Turns out the proof is flawed. He spends a hellish month after month trying to repair the flaw. He can't. And he's talk about suffering, he's in total despair. And just one day he's sitting at his desk and he sees it. He just sees it. Mm-hmm. And the answer to how to prove it. And so many, we've all experienced this in daily life. Once you get older, you experience this in daily life frequently, which is you want to remember somebody's name or who starred in some movie or who wrote that song. And you start thinking about it. You go through the alphabet, trying to figure out what letter it might start with to trigger your memory. And what almost always works for me, and I think it works for everyone, is stop thinking about it. And in 10 minutes, have somebody ask you again. And it just pops right into your head. Something about the way our brain accesses the hard drive it's obscured from us, obviously, like many things are. Let's I probably lost all of our economics listeners, but in case any of them are still hanging on, what are the implications of the mindset that you're talking about in the book, which is, you just referenced, which is I feel like I'm in charge, but I'm really not, which meditation forces you to confront. What are the implications of that for economics, say, or public policy? A lot of people would argue because we don't really know our own best interests, we need to be taken care of, we need to be nudged. Paternalism is necessary and not just it's not something we should hold our nose at. It's imperative. What are your thoughts on that, especially after you've been thinking about this for a long time?
Sounds like you're trying to steer me towards some Buddhism libertarianism synthesis here,
exactly.
Russ. Do I have your agenda sized up accurately?
Actually not, because I already did that with the emergent stuff. Now is your time to bring it back into the we have to run people's lives because they're a bunch of crazy people.
I guess I wouldn't. It's not so much that I would see policy implications. At least, I mean, none are occurring to me right now. Maybe if I meditate for half an hour, some will show up. But I think there's an interesting analogy, just metaphorically, between the libertarian approach to the economy, and I should concede I'm not a libertarian at the risk of alienating maybe some of your listeners, but there's an analogy between that and the way the mind works. In other words, the libertarian attitude toward the economy is maybe a productive attitude to take towards your mind, and it is in a certain sense one that's being encouraged in mindfulness meditation, which is to say, trust a certain set of the workings of it, a little more than you do.
But Bob, I want to push you in the other direction.
Okay.
The psychology of the book, which we haven't gotten into very much, psychology research, partly because I'm a skeptic about psychology research, but that's a topic for another time. The psychology research that you bring, and you could argue the evolutionary material that you bring, suggests that the human brain leads us to illusion, and certainly this is the Buddhist perspective as well. So we're all full of illusion, full of delusion, and we don't know what's best for ourselves. We eat too many powdered donuts, and we don't sleep enough, and we spend too much time on the internet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can't control our urges, and so therefore we need a more powerful state, a more powerful interventionist government to take care of us, because we're so deeply flawed.
Well, I would just say that to the extent that we don't solve our problems ourselves, there's a stronger case for that. I won't rehash all the standard arguments, which is that if drug addiction is creating negative social externalities, then it is, a more legitimate public policy target than if it's not. Although I think you could make a case for it in some sense either way, but certainly it's well, I guess I would say that we're talking about a set of techniques when we talk about mindfulness meditation that can empower people to solve some of their own problems without forms of assistance that might have otherwise come from the government in principle. And by the way, the treatment of addiction, there's a specific kind of mindfulness technique. I talk about it a little bit in the book.
Yep.
That helps people quit smoking and so on, like that. I mean, even though I'm not a libertarian, I'm in favor of as much self-reliance as possible in solving problems. It's just almost inherently more efficient. And I think this is a major set of tools to use in that regard. I don't know if that responds to your question. I may have continued to resist your agenda. I'm sorry.
Not at all. No, that's
my ideology compels me to resist.
No, you took me in a direction even that I had. That was great. Let me mention Adam Smith. We've talked about his work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and Smith talks about human beings' desire to be loved and lovely. We want attention. We want to be respected. We want to be admired. We want to be liked, and we want to be worthy of it, which is the twist on it that I think doesn't fit so well with the evolutionary. First part fits fine with evolution. Second part's a little bit more is a little harder to square. He argues that we actually want to be good, because we want to earn the respect that other people have for us. We want to recognize that we're relatively unimportant relative to other people, even though everything inside us says me, me, me. And he says all that without relying on benevolence. He doesn't think we're very benevolent or good-hearted to start with, but he suggests that culture encourages us to be less self-interested than we otherwise would be because we want that respect from other people.
Right.
And we want to have it fully. Reflect on how that fits in with, say, Buddhism or how meditation might interplay with that.
Well, first of all, I think, it's pretty broadly consistent with evolutionary psychology in the sense that it makes sense that we want the esteem of people. That seems to have been correlated with getting genes in the next generation, having the esteem of people, being highly thought of, having high local status, and so on. And that includes having esteem in matters of moral conduct. We want to be thought of as good people. Now, in fact, that tendency seems to be so strong that we have mechanisms for convincing ourselves that we're good even when we're not. I mean, if you ask, survey after survey has shown is that if you ask people whether they are better morally than the average person, a large majority say they are. Well, obviously, they're not all right? I mean,
criminals, I think, see themselves. I'm sure there's survey data on this, but I've seen casual data that they think of themselves basically a good person, right?
Right. No, I mean that's the way we are, and that's kind of doesn't sound all that harmful to have a slight inflation of self-esteem. At the same time, but the flip side of that is convincing ourselves that various other people who are impeding our short-term agenda are bad people, and so on. There's a whole set of moral biases built into us that in the aggregate are not, well, to put it in economic terms, are not conducive to social efficiency, really. They lead to, we all waste a lot of time so distorting the data, so to speak, and telling stories that distort the data and behaving more badly than we would if we had a clearer view of ourselves. And meditation, I think, is good about clearing away those obstacles, and in fact, or those distortions. And in fact, if you ask, what does Buddhism mean by these crazy sounding claims like not self, like the self in some sense does not exist, or emptiness, that things don't have essence? I argue in the book that, leave aside what the full-on not self or emptiness experience is like. Very few of us will ever find out. We just won't meditate for 5 hours a day for 5 years or whatever it might take us. I think we do make incremental progress toward in the direction of those things. And that incremental progress is very easy to understand. It's just a slight dilution of, unfair judgments of people, an exaggerated sense of your own moral entitlement and things like that. And I think that's all to the good. And it would be one thing if I was asking people to sacrifice, because I know some people think, well, wait, then I'm not pursuing my agenda. I'm not, I'm not getting what's mine. Again, the Buddhist claim, which I think is borne out, is that becoming a better person can align with becoming a happier person and with seeing the world more clearly. That's an amazing claim when you think about it, that you can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. But I think it's true. It's not trivially easy. It's not magic. You have to decide that meditation is worth it, stick with it, and ideally view it in light, in a kind of philosophical light of the kind we've been describing. But I really think the central claim is true.
Well, Smith says later on, still in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he says, there are 2 paths in life to get us admired, respected, and loved. One is fame, power, and money. People who are powerful, famous, and rich get a lot of attention and satisfy that urge. He says the other way is to be virtuous and wise, and he suggests you take the less glittering path, the one of virtue and wisdom. And the reason we can close on this, the reason I mention it is that I want to bring in a couple things from before as well. The strange thing I find about the mindfulness movement, what some people call McMindfulness, the commoditization and commercialization of mindfulness, so that it's going to make you more productive, it's going to make you happier, and I think that's a it's not what actually happens, at least in the direct consequence. It could be a second order effect through the goodness mechanism, and I do. As a religious person, the part that for religion brings to my meditation is a desire to be good, not just happy. And I think that's missing from a lot of, say, corporate mindfulness programs, I'm guessing. I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time in them. You go ahead.
I suspect that's true. They certainly try not to connect in these institutional settings. They tend to try not to connect any of this to Buddhist philosophy, but that just creates political problems for them to the extent that it sounds religious, even though we're basically talking about secular Buddhism, not the supernatural part. But what I'm trying to show in the book is not like how to be happy. There are books like that. I'm trying to make the case that in principle, this kind of happiness is a valid happiness, which, in other words, it can align with better behavior, a clear perception of the world. So in other words, there can be a convergence of happiness, moral truth, and truth, objective truth about the world, so to speak, in principle. And I agree with you that I think the best way to approach it is not to worry about the happiness part. Try to view the world more clearly and try to focus on impediments to behaving decently toward your fellow human beings, and the rest will fall into place. And I try to focus at least on those two dimensions, at least as much as on the happiness part.
My guest today has been Robert Wright. His book is Why Buddhism Is True. Bob, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. I really appreciate it.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.